Trump has published basically an ultimatum towards Putin about ending the war. But we'll talk about this as well as about what has happened along the front lines and behind them in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. Surfshark VPN is sponsoring this channel for this month. If you want to bypass geo-blocking or hide your internet activity all with a convenient app, then use Surfshark VPN for just $2.09 a month by using my link. You get 4 months extra as well. Thank you, Surfshark, for sponsoring this channel. Ukraine is continuing its strikes against the Russian defense industry, and oil refineries among the targets that were hit was the Smolensk aircraft factory that is responsible for the production of Sukhoi 25 close air support planes as well as their modernization. Also, a chemical factory in Saratov was hit by the Ukrainians. We'll switch to the developments along the front line here, and we have a geolocation in Kursk here at Nikolayevo-Darino. Here, the Russians have entered the center of the town. I'm not sure exactly where they came from, whether they crossed over the river here like this, or whether they came from Darino that was recently recovered by them. But the matter of fact seems to be that Nikolayevo-Darino is now back in Russian hands. So this is probably at the very least a contested area now, if not under Russian control. To the northeast of it at Malaya Loknia, the Russians did a massive mechanized attack. They entered the town of Viktorovka with it. They reached the outskirts of it, but from the videos I've seen, I do not see that they succeeded. They suffered heavy losses. That is confirmed in visual evidence, both in men as well as in materiel, but whether they managed to push the Ukrainians away and reoccupy Viktorovka, I cannot confirm as of now. We'll have to see about that in the future. That seems to be it for the region of Kursk. That was all that has happened along the front lines in the past 2 days. We switch to Kharkiv. Here, nothing has happened on the ground, no change in territory over the past few days either. We go to the Eastern Front, and here the Russians gained additional grounds in Dvorichna. They gained roughly this area now over the past few days and thus expanded their bridgehead over the Oskil River. South of it, the Russians gained additional territory here, south of Andrivka. Roughly this area is now under Russian control as well. But that was it north of the Seversky Donetsk, the river that flows here in territorial changes. We switch to the area south of it. Seversk, fighting is reported, but no change in territory. We go to Chasiv Yar, and that is obviously one of the more important battles right now. And here we have the Russians again in the southern part of it, or at least south of the factory, confirming their presence down here now as well. And we have them southeast of Chasiv Yar here in the forested area that is now seemingly occupied as well. So the front line is probably like this as of now, as the Russians are confirmed to be in the buildings inside of the forest here over the past few days. We switch to the Toretsk region, and there we have a couple of geolocations again. We have the Russians in the northeast of it. We have them at the center, more or less, of Krimske, which seems to be a suburb of Toretsk itself. I'm not 100% sure if it counts as its own town, but at least in the built-up area, it's part of Toretsk. And we have them here in the north of Toretsk at the waste heap of a mine here as well. The geolocations have been all over the place. There seem to still be some Ukrainian presence inside of it. Where exactly is unclear. So we're looking at the pro-Russian map of Krimi Caprice, who only takes geolocations. And according to his map, this is the situation where the Russians have recently been spotted. As you can see, there might be, according to this, again, this is pro-Russian, but all geolocated. So all of this is proven, but it doesn't prove permanent Russian presence. It was proven that Russians were here, but that does not mean they haven't been pushed back. But if we take the latest positions, then there might be some Ukrainian presence left here and some here at Krimske, but that's now more or less it. The majority of Toretsk is under Russian control as of now, and the geolocations seem to confirm that. We go to the area of Pokrovsk, and here the Russians have advanced north and in of Kotline. North of Kotline and in Kotline, which is here, so to the west of Pokrovsk. we have geolocations of this as well. They are inside of Kotlin now. We now have visual evidence. I didn't have it in the last situation report, even though I assumed that Kotlin is likely in Russian hands. Now that another geolocation shows the Russians north of it as well, so we can assume that Kotlin is in Russian hands. But the Ukrainians did a counterattack here and were pushing up to this point. Whether they managed to retake the houses south of the railroad, I cannot confirm, and there's no visual evidence for this, but it shows us continued Ukrainian counterattacks in that area. That was it from the Pokrovsk area in the region. If we go to the Kurakhove area, there the Russians managed to advance west of Slovianka here. They gained additional ground in the forested areas here, where they managed to gain a foothold further west, and they advanced west of Petropavlivka, and that's the one I have here as well. You see they are halfway to Andrivka and almost in a process of bypassing them in the north. So the Russians have reached this point as well. So likely this here is now under Russian control. That's it from the Kurakhove area, but in Velika Novosilka, the situation is getting ever more dramatic because we have visual evidence that the Russians crossed the Mokryali River here in the north. We have a geolocation of this as well. There a Russian BMP-2 gets destroyed, but it shows that the Russians not just crossed it by foot, but they crossed it with mechanized equipment. Now the BMP-2 is capable of swimming. It's amphibious, I think not amphibious, so not for an amphibic landing, but it can cross a small river or something if the waves aren't too high, and if the riverbanks here aren't too steep, it can simply drive through. But this obviously means there's a huge risk of forces cutting off the last lines of communication into Velika Novosilka, and in this case the Russians have been stopped, but the area where the Ukrainians can supply Velika Novosilka is getting ever smaller. We also have the Russians that have advanced in the eastern part. They took control over this area and they have almost reached the center here in Velika Novosilka. In the last situation report, I showed you that I think it was here. Here they occupied the cemetery and they advanced further to the west from it, pushing the Ukrainians further deeply into Velika Novosilka. And there seems to be a process of withdrawing right now. There's a geolocated video that shows Ukrainians here, but the video shows them being hit with artillery. So infantry walking here being hit by Russian artillery. As we look on the map, the evacuation of the Ukrainians is likely currently in process because that situation at least seems to be untenable looking on the map itself. That was it with the developments along the front line. Siersky mentioned something about the Russian losses in 2024. He said the Russians lost 434,000 men last year. 150,000 of those have been KIAs, but the Russians continue to try making up those losses with new recruitments. That is causing problems though. Here we have a Russian mill blogger complaining about the quality of artillery ammunition. He mentions that the powder inside of the ammunition is inconsistent, and the different amount of it obviously means that the shells have different weights, and that would lead to a different performance once they are fired, and thus making them inaccurate. He mentions that the military command has banned them from opening the shells to weigh the powder, but to be perfectly honest, that doesn't make too much sense to me. First of all, artillery has separate loads. It's not like a cartridge for a rifle where you have both the projectile as well as the powder in one package. That is, artillery loads the shell and the powder bag separately. So you could just weigh the artillery shell without opening it, and you would still see that it weighs differently, because no part of it, of the shell itself, means a difference except in the explosion on the ground. None of it is being lost. None of the weight is being lost by firing it itself. So if the weight is different, you could weigh it without opening it, and the powder bags could be weighed as well. So that, to be perfectly honest, doesn't make complete sense to me, but that doesn't mean that he's right and I'm wrong, or I don't understand some circumstances here. I just realized that something there doesn't sound right, and it felt it was appropriate to mention it. But Russia is continuing to get additional aid here. More Koksuns are arriving. Those are heavy North Korean artillery, 40-kilometer range or even more of this, with rocket-assisted shells up to 60 kilometers, if I'm not wrong, 170 millimeters, but the firing rate is extremely low. Still, though, the Russians continued receiving those self-propelled guns as they use a caliber the North Koreans have and the Russians haven't used. So that would open up additional routes of ammunition to be used by the Russians as well, which would make perfect sense for the Russians to employ them here. The Ukrainians are saying, Syrskyi in this case, that almost half of the North Korean has already fallen. Has become a casualty. Not all of them have fallen, but they mention that they are well trained, they are brave, and they are highly motivated. So while they suffer heavy losses, they do achieve something on the ground, and they are being respected as good fighters. We'll talk about troop generation in Ukraine, and that's becoming important in the future because the Kiev Independent publishes a survey according to which 1/5 would move abroad if the travel restrictions are lifted. That means right now women can leave the country, but men between 18 and 60 or 65 can't because of the war and the laws according to it, the martial law that has been enacted, mobilization, they can't leave. And this means that 1/5 would leave. The survey says that 33% of the 18 to 29-year-olds would leave, a full third of them. 25% are men, 19 are women. So a majority of men would be among those who leave because otherwise they might be forced to go back into the fight. This shows how important a permanent peace is for Ukraine, something we mentioned here on the channel a couple of times in the past. For Ukraine, it's not just about stopping the dying. It means they need to be sure that there is not going to be another war, because otherwise the people are going to flee and not going to come back, and Ukraine will simply collapse due to the lack of Ukrainians, due to the lack of foreign investment, and it will be a ripe fruit ready for the taking for the Russians in any future attack. So whatever comes now needs to be, it's absolutely mandatory for it to be a permanent end of the war without a likelihood of a second war that will ever happen again. The Ukrainians also arrested the brigade commander of the 155th Brigade, Anne of Kiev. It's the brigade that was trained by the French, which had an extremely high AWOL rate. People were leaving without permission, and apparently that wasn't reported in time, and that's one of the reasons they were arrested. But we come to the highlight, and that surely is this year. Donald Trump published something which is basically an ultimatum. He says it's time to make peace. If Russia does not make peace, then punishment will come, and punishment, he mentions only financial one. We need to acknowledge this as of now. So taxes, tariffs, sanctions, anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Let's get this So this would likely include the Western nations as well that currently are still buying LPG. They still buy gas. They still buy oil from Russia, sometimes not directly, sometimes directly. But in other times, the Russians just sell the oil to the Indians, for instance, and they then sell it on to Europe, which in the end is still using Russian carbohydrates. So this is the first step that Putin will face by Donald Trump, and he does it in the usual way. He compliments him first and then starts to threaten it. This means we can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. Now, this is an ultimatum. Let's not get this wrong. But the point is probably that he is ignoring that Putin wants to subdue Ukraine. He doesn't want peace. Putin isn't looking for a way out. He wants to win this war. And so threatening them and believing that Russia is under pressure, but it's not enough under pressure that Putin is looking for a way out right now. So this will likely fail, especially if it's not combined with military aid. For instance, Trump saying if Russia doesn't move, then Ukraine will receive Tomahawk missiles and be allowed to use them as they wish for. So we have to see how that continues, but we see the first steps Trumps are taking. I would guess this is going to fail as of now, because I think think this here misunderstands Putin's intentions. That is to subdue Ukraine. It's not to end the war as fast as possible. It also ignores that Ukraine will not sign a peace agreement that is the end of Ukraine. There's simply no reason for it. Ukraine is better off fighting on and hoping for the best and hoping for a miracle than agreeing to sign something that will mean the end of the Ukrainian state. And anything that stops any further Russian aggression will be the end of the Ukrainian state. So he will not have the means to force Ukraine into a peace agreement that means the end for them. This means Putin is likely not going to give in. Ukraine is likely not going to give in. We'll have to see how he continues there, whether he's willing to increase the pressure, especially against the Russians, because with Ukraine, his means are somewhat limited, except for not sending additional aid, which would then mean a defeat that should hurt American interests, but he can't force Ukraine to give in. Another option would obviously be not just to increase the pressure on Putin, but to simply give up. We talked about it here in the past on the channel, but that's obviously an option too. If he doesn't achieve what he gets, that he says, I did my best, but I couldn't help it, like he kind of did with North Korea. Anyways, we'll have to see. He starts off with pressure against Russia, not against Ukraine at this part, and I guess at this point it is fairly good news. That was it for today in the situation report. If you like this, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment. What do you think what Trump will achieve in regards to Putin? And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.